The rain fell softly over the old countryside estate, its rhythmic patter against the windows echoing through the silent halls of the once grand mansion. The scent of lavender and aged wood lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the ghostly stillness that always seemed to accompany loss. In that moment, Adrian felt both small and misplaced, standing before the mahogany casket that held his late Aunt Eleanor, the woman who, for reasons he never quite understood, had always looked at him with eyes that seemed to see someone else entirely. The funeral was modest but filled with emotion. Family and a handful of townsfolk had gathered, each whispering about Eleanor's eccentricities, her mysterious travels, her secretive nature, her stubborn independence. Adrian had loved her in his own quiet way. She'd been his mother's older sister, the one who always brought him strange gifts when he was a child. Ornate hairpins from Paris, silk scarves from Kyoto, a delicate pearl necklace once said to belong to someone who lived between worlds. She had no husband, no children. But she had left behind stories. And as it turned out, a will that would pull Adrian into one of those stories more deeply than he ever imagined. After the guests departed, Adrian found himself sitting across from Mr. Crane, the family lawyer. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and candle smoke. The man's glasses glinted under the dim light as he opened a thick folder and began to read. "To my beloved nephew Adrian Clark," Crane began, his voice steady and deliberate. "I leave the manor, its grounds and all assets therein, under one condition." Adrian frowned. "Condition?" Crane nodded. "Yes. Your aunt's will states that you must fulfill her final wish. For a period of 1 full year you are to live here not as Adrian Clark but as Adrian Clark." The words hung heavy in the air. Adrian blinked, unsure if he'd misheard. "Adrian!" Crane cleared his throat. "Yes, it's all written here in detail. You must assume her chosen identity for you. Dressing, living, and presenting as a woman. The staff she left behind will assist you, and a monthly allowance will be provided for your comfort. Only after completing the year in full will you legally inherit everything she has left." Adrian felt his chest tighten. He laughed awkwardly, thinking it might be some kind of elaborate joke. "You're serious?" "I'm afraid so," the lawyer said, pushing the papers forward. "Your aunt was quite particular in her wording. She wrote that she wanted you to see yourself as she once did, the way the mirror never could." That phrase made something stir uneasily inside him. The mirror never could. It was the kind of cryptic sentence Aunt Eleanor loved to say. She was a woman of riddles, someone who always believed in symbols and hidden meanings. Adrian left the lawyer's office with a copy of the will and a swirl of confusion clouding his thoughts. The inheritance was substantial, more money than he'd ever see in a lifetime, but the condition felt surreal. Pretend to be a woman. For a year. What was she thinking? That night, he sat in his small apartment, staring at the will under the glow of a single lamp. He remembered the last time he'd spoken to Eleanor, just a few weeks before her passing. She had held his hand tightly and whispered, "You'll understand soon, my dear. You always were more like me than you realized." At the time he'd smiled politely, thinking it was the rambling of an old woman in declining health. Now the words haunted him. When he told his parents, they reacted with disbelief. His mother was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "She always had her odd ways, but this? It's absurd. You can't possibly go through with it, Adrian." His father crossed his arms. "Let the estate go. We don't need her conditions. You're a man, not her little experiment." But deep inside, Adrian felt something more complicated. It wasn't about the money, though it was a tempting fortune. It was about understanding her. The way she always saw him differently. The way she sometimes called him "my beautiful Adrian" when he was a child, brushing his hair from his forehead and telling him he had the gentlest eyes she'd ever seen. The next morning, he packed a small bag and drove back to the manor. The place felt alive somehow, even though it was empty. The grand staircase loomed in front of him, and sunlight filtered through the stained glass window, casting soft shades of rose and gold across the marble floor. It felt feminine, as if the entire house held its breath waiting for him to change something within it, or within himself. In the foyer, he found a note written in her flowing cursive, sealed with red wax. My dearest Adrian, if you are reading this, it means you have chosen curiosity over fear. And that, my dear, is the first step. The wardrobe in my room holds your beginning. Everything else will follow in time. Don't fight it. Trust it. I did. With love that never fades, Aunt Eleanor. He stared at the letter for a long time before climbing the stairs. Each creak of the old wood sounded like a whisper. When he opened the door to her room, the familiar scent of rosewater and old perfume filled his lungs. The wardrobe stood against the far wall, tall, carved, and imposing. He hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside hung rows of dresses, some vintage, others modern. Silks, satins, soft knits in shades of cream, blush, and midnight blue. And among them, carefully folded on a shelf, were a few articles of clothing clearly meant for him. New, his size, yet unmistakably feminine. There was also a small wooden box. He opened it and found a delicate gold locket, with an inscription inside. To Adrian, the truth is only hidden by the reflection. Adrian sat on the edge of the bed, the locket in his hand, his mind spinning. The idea of actually doing this, dressing as a woman, living as one, felt ridiculous. But at the same time, there was a strange magnetic pull, a curiosity that gnawed at his chest. That night he stood in front of the mirror. His reflection stared back, a young man with soft features, slightly overgrown hair, and uncertainty in his eyes. He tried to imagine what Aunt Eleanor had seen in him. The gentleness she spoke of. The unspoken something that he had never tried to name. He ran his fingers through his hair and whispered, "Adrian." It sounded foreign, but not entirely wrong. He didn't sleep much that night. When dawn broke, he stood before the wardrobe again, this time pulling out one of the simple dresses, a soft cream-colored one with lace at the sleeves. His hands trembled as he held it up. The fabric was smooth, cool against his skin. He thought about how absurd it would look, how strange he would feel. But he also thought about her, the woman who had believed in something beyond the surface. The one who'd spent her life chasing truth in unconventional ways. He took a deep breath. And slowly he began to change. First the undergarments, then the dress itself, carefully slipping it over his shoulders. Fit shockingly well. When he looked in the mirror again, his reflection startled him. Not because he looked feminine, not yet, but because for the first time he didn't see the same person staring back. He saw someone new, someone who might have always been waiting. He stood there, watching himself breathe, the faintest blush rising to his cheeks. There was discomfort, yes, but also a quiet, inexplicable peace. Maybe, he thought, this was what Aunt Eleanor had meant. The beginning. Outside, the rain had stopped, and sunlight spilled across the room. The locket around his neck caught the light, glowing faintly. Adrian, or Adrian, didn't know it yet, but the transformation had already begun. The following morning, sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, painting delicate patterns across the bedspread. Adrian, still wearing the cream dress he'd tried on the night before, woke slowly, unsure if the previous day had been a dream. The scent of lavender lingered in the air, just like when Aunt Eleanor was alive. For a fleeting moment, he thought he heard her humming from the hallway. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. The locket around his neck felt heavier now, as if its weight had deepened overnight. Everything about this house felt strange, alive even. And though he'd promised himself this was only temporary, part of him couldn't ignore the way his aunt's presence seemed to hang in every corner. He went downstairs to find breakfast already prepared on the dining table. Fresh scones, tea, and fruit were neatly arranged. There was also a note in the same elegant handwriting. "My dear Adrian, the world is ready to meet you. You'll find all you need in the dressing room. Remember, the challenge isn't to pretend, it's to discover." He stared at the note, his pulse quickening. The challenge. That word echoed in his mind. Sounded like something more than just wearing dresses and walking differently. When he entered the dressing room, he found that Aunt Eleanor's staff had indeed remained. 2 women stood waiting, both older, elegant, with kind but knowing eyes. The taller one smiled. "Good morning, Miss Clark." He froze. Adrian." "Adrian," she corrected gently. "Your aunt's wish was clear. And if you're to honor her, we will help you." The shorter woman nodded, opening a set of drawers filled with cosmetics, wigs, jewelry, and all manner of accessories. "She told us this day would come. Said you might resist at first, but your heart would lead you where you need to be." Adrian swallowed hard. "You both know about this." They exchanged a look that bordered on affection. "We do," said the taller one. "I'm Mrs. Wren. This is Clara. We served your aunt for years. She prepared us for your arrival, Miss Clark." Adrian didn't know what to say. The sight of makeup and jewelry filled him with nervous energy. But there was something else too, a quiet curiosity. Mrs. Wren gestured toward the vanity. "If you'll sit, we'll begin." He hesitated, then slowly lowered himself into the chair. The mirror reflected not just his nervous face, but also the women standing behind him, calm and composed, as if they'd done this many times before. Clara began to speak softly as she worked. "Your aunt believed people carry 2 reflections, the one the world demands and the one that waits behind the eyes. She said yours was the second." Adrian tried to laugh, but his voice came out shakier than he intended. "She always spoke in riddles." Mrs. Wren smiled faintly. "Sometimes riddles are just truths dressed in patience." They began applying light foundation, soft blush, and a subtle tint on his lips. It was strange. He expected to feel embarrassed or foolish, but instead, he found himself studying each change with quiet fascination. The reflection staring back was unfamiliar yet oddly comforting. When Clara placed a wig, a shoulder-length auburn style, on his head and adjusted it carefully, Adrian hardly recognized himself. The transformation wasn't complete, but something inside shifted. "You see," Mrs. Wren murmured. "Adrian suits you." He looked at his reflection again. The gentle curve of his lips, the warm tone of the wig against his skin, the softness in his expression. It wasn't Adrian pretending. It was Adrian beginning to surface. He tried to smile, though his chest felt tight. "So this is the challenge. To look like her idea of me." Mrs. Wren shook her head. "No, dear. The challenge is to live like her idea of you. To walk through the world and see if it feels wrong, or perhaps more right than you expected." Those words lingered in his mind all afternoon. By evening, Mrs. Wren had chosen a simple outfit for him to wear outside. A long floral skirt, a light blouse, and a soft cardigan. "We'll start small," she said kindly. "A short walk into the village. Just to get some air." He wanted to protest, to say that people would stare or laugh, but somehow he couldn't. He remembered the condition in the will. Full year. He had to live it. So he took a deep breath and stepped outside. The gravel crunched beneath his shoes. The breeze played with the strands of his wig. Every sound seemed louder, the chirping of birds, the rustling of trees, the beating of his own heart. As he walked down the narrow lane toward the village, he kept his head slightly bowed, but not out of shame. It was as though the world had slowed to notice him differently. For once, he wasn't invisible. People glanced his way, not with ridicule but curiosity. An older shopkeeper at the corner smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, miss. Haven't seen you around here before." For a heartbeat, Adrian froze. Then, almost without thinking, he said softly, "Good afternoon." The words came out lighter, softer. The shopkeeper returned his smile, and the conversation passed like a summer breeze. Yet inside, something profound had shifted. He had just been seen, accepted as Adrian. When he returned to the manor, his pulse was still racing. Mrs. Wren met him at the door. How did it feel? He hesitated, his hand brushing the locket at his neck. Strange, but peaceful. Like I wasn't pretending. She nodded knowingly. Then you've already passed the first part of her challenge. Later that night, as he stood before the mirror again, Adrian traced the reflection with his eyes. The eyeliner had smudged slightly, and his wig was a little uneven, but he didn't care. He saw something softer, freer. Something he couldn't name yet. The locket gleamed faintly under the lamplight, and when he opened it, he noticed something he hadn't before. A small folded paper tucked inside. His hands trembled as he pulled it out and unfolded it. It was written in Aunt Eleanor's handwriting. To my beloved Adrian, you'll never find yourself by standing still. Let the world see what I saw in you. Someone brave enough to live without masks. The truth waits for those who dare to walk toward it. He read the words over and over until they blurred. He didn't know what kind of truth she meant, but he was beginning to feel it whisper in the quiet spaces of his mind. That night he dreamt of her. She stood in a white dress at the edge of a vast garden, her hair caught in the wind, smiling the way she used to when she was about to reveal a secret. You're closer than you think, my dear, she said softly. The challenge isn't about who you become, it's about who you stop pretending not to be. When he awoke, his heart was pounding. He didn't fully understand what her words meant, but they echoed through his thoughts all morning. And as the days turned into weeks, the challenge deepened. He learned how to walk in heels, how to adjust his tone, how to hold himself differently. Not out of mockery, but out of respect for the promise he'd made. Yet, with each passing day, it became less about inheritance and more about discovery. Adrian's posture softened. His laughter sounded warmer. His reflection no longer startled him. He began to recognize Adrian in subtle gestures, the way his hands moved, the way his eyes lingered thoughtfully on things he once overlooked. But with every step forward came a strange tension. He couldn't tell where Adrian ended and Adrian began. Sometimes, when he removed the makeup at night, he felt almost hollow, as though washing away something essential. Other times, when he looked at himself fully dressed as Adrian, he felt complete, yet confused by that completeness. One evening, while brushing his wig in front of the mirror, he whispered, "Aunt Eleanor, what are you trying to tell me?" The house creaked softly, as if answering. He caught a flicker of movement in the reflection, just a shimmer of light near the doorway, and for a brief second, he thought he saw her standing there, smiling gently. He turned around quickly, but the doorway was empty. Only the faint scent of rosewater lingered. He sat in silence, heart racing, wondering if grief was playing tricks on him, or if, in some inexplicable way, she was still guiding him through the challenge. Outside, the moonlight washed over the manor, silver and quiet. Inside, Adrian Clark sat before the mirror, the faintest trace of tears in her eyes. The challenge had only just begun. The days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life inside the manor began to change. What had started as an awkward experiment, a forced act of obedience, was gradually becoming a quiet routine that wove itself into Adrian's life like silk threads tightening around his soul. Morning tea with Mrs. Wren and Clara became a ritual. They no longer called him Mr. Clark. To them, he was Miss Adrian, and though the name had once felt foreign, it now rolled naturally off their tongues, and disturbingly his own. Each morning, Clara helped him choose an outfit suited for the day. Sometimes a casual skirt and blouse for errands in the village, other times a flowing dress for quiet afternoons spent reading in the garden. The first few times he'd looked at himself fully dressed, the sight had made his heart pound with embarrassment. But now there was comfort in it. The gentle brush of fabric, the weight of earrings brushing his neck, the faint scent of perfume, all of it whispered a strange familiarity that both frightened and soothed him. The world outside seemed to adjust too. The villagers had grown used to seeing Miss Clark around town. They greeted her with smiles, casual nods, and polite conversation. Nobody looked twice anymore. That anonymity, being noticed yet not recognized, gave him an unexpected sense of freedom. One afternoon, while walking through the town square, Adrian stopped by a small flower shop. The air was thick with the scent of roses and lilies, and behind the counter stood a young woman named Lila, her auburn curls tied back with a ribbon. "Miss Clark, I was hoping you'd come by again," she said warmly. "The hydrangeas you bought last week were a perfect choice. You have a wonderful eye for colors." Adrian smiled. "Thank you. I suppose I'm learning." Lila laughed softly. "Well, you seem like someone who notices beauty. Not everyone does." That compliment lingered with her long after she returned home. Beauty. It wasn't something Adrian had ever associated with himself. But Adrian, she was beginning to see it differently. That evening, as she stood before the vanity brushing her wig, she caught her reflection smiling, not out of vanity but peace. She traced her jawline, studying the soft blush on her cheeks. The transformation wasn't just an appearance. It had settled deeper, somewhere beneath her skin. Mrs. Wren entered quietly, carrying a tray of tea. "You've taken to this life well, Miss Clark. Your aunt would be proud." Adrian looked down. "Sometimes I wonder if she knew something about me I didn't." Mrs. Wren smiled knowingly. Oh, she knew many things. But mostly, she knew how the heart hides behind fear. She wanted you to see what happens when fear fades. That night, unable to sleep, Adrian walked through the manor's dimly lit halls. The portraits of ancestors stared down at her with solemn eyes. But one painting near the staircase caught her attention, a portrait of Aunt Eleanor in her youth. She was standing in the same garden Adrian had visited earlier that day, wearing a white gown, her expression gentle but strong. There was something hauntingly familiar in that face. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her lips. It wasn't just family resemblance. It was something deeper, something mirrored. Adrian reached out and touched the edge of the frame. "What were you trying to tell me?" she whispered. And then she noticed it. A tiny inscription etched faintly into the corner of the frame. "Truth blooms when you stop pruning yourself to fit the garden." The phrase lingered in her mind for days. It was during that week that she began keeping a journal. Something Eleanor had once told her was the only way to hear your own heart without interruption. Each entry was signed Adrian, never Adrian. At first, it was an unconscious habit, but later it became deliberate. She wrote about her daily experiences, the warmth of sunlight through the window, the quiet hum of bees in the garden, the peculiar sense of calm that came with seeing herself as Adrian. She also wrote about confusion, the tug-of-war between her old identity and the new one blossoming inside her. But what surprised her most was that Adrian's name began to feel distant, like an echo from another life. One morning, as she sat at the vanity, Clara entered carrying a sealed envelope. "This was delivered today, Miss Clark." Adrian took it, recognizing the handwriting immediately. It was her mother's. Her heart skipped. She opened it carefully. "Adrian, we've been worried about you. Your father thinks this whole thing has gone too far. You've been gone for months, and we barely hear from you anymore. Please come home. We can sort this out together. Whatever your aunt wanted, you've done enough. Love, Mum." She read the letter twice, her hands trembling slightly. The words felt like a tug pulling her backward, to the world of expectations, labels, and the version of herself she thought she had to be. She sat in silence for a long time before whispering aloud. But who exactly would go home now? Adrian, or Adrian? She looked up at her reflection and saw neither clearly, just a blend of both. Later that evening, Mrs. Wren found her sitting by the fireplace, the letter on her lap. "You miss them," she said softly. Adrian nodded. "Yes, but I also don't know how to face them anymore. They wouldn't understand." Mrs. Wren poured tea into a delicate cup and handed it to her. "Perhaps they're not meant to understand yet. Some truths are not told, they're lived." Adrian smiled faintly. "You sound like her." "She taught me well," Mrs. Wren replied. "And she believed in you more than you realize." That night, the dream returned. Aunt Eleanor was in the same white dress, walking through the garden. This time she looked directly at Adrian and said, "You're almost there, my dear. The mirror has begun to soften." Adrian stepped closer. "What does that mean?" Eleanor's eyes sparkled. "When the reflection softens, The truth begins to breathe. Adrian reached out to touch her hand, but woke up before she could. The next morning, she found a new note placed neatly on her vanity. She didn't remember putting it there. "You're not losing yourself, my darling. You're uncovering the one who was waiting beneath the surface all along." The handwriting was unmistakably Eleanor's. Adrian pressed the note to her chest, tears forming in her eyes. "I miss you," she whispered. "But I think I'm starting to understand." From that day on, the transformation deepened, not just outwardly but within. Adrian began speaking more softly, moving with grace, finding joy in the little rituals Eleanor had once loved. Afternoon tea, playing the piano, tending to the roses. The manor no longer felt haunted, felt alive. But with the calm came an undercurrent of unease. Because the more Adrian lived this life, the harder it became to remember how Adrian used to feel. It was as if he was fading, not erased but absorbed like ink spreading through water. One evening, while watching the sunset from the veranda, Adrian whispered into the wind, "Who am I now?" The breeze carried the scent of roses through the air. And somewhere, faintly, she thought she heard her aunt's voice reply, "You are becoming who you always were." The locket around her neck grew warm, almost pulsing against her skin. When she opened it later that night, she found something new, a tiny photograph tucked behind the inscription. It was of Eleanor as a young woman, standing beside a child. The child wore a dress and smiled brightly, eyes wide with innocence. The back of the photo bore a single line in faded ink. "My little Adrian, long before the world told you otherwise." Adrian sat motionless for a long time, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. She didn't remember ever wearing a dress as a child, but something deep inside her stirred, like a long-buried memory awakening. Was this possible? Had Eleanor known something hidden even from her parents? The truth, whatever it was, waited like a shadow just out of reach. And as the clock chimed midnight, Adrian whispered to her reflection, her voice trembling but resolute, "I don't think I can go back anymore." The mirror reflected her tear-streaked face, but behind the sorrow was a strange, luminous calm, the peace of someone who had stopped pretending. Outside, the wind rustled the roses. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled softly, like the prelude to revelation. The manor felt different now. Quieter, yes, but not empty. Every corner seemed to hum with an invisible life, as if the walls themselves were listening to her heartbeat. Adrian had stopped trying to correct people who called her Miss Clark. The name no longer felt like a disguise. It felt like air, soft, effortless, necessary. Her transformation had reached a rhythm that blurred the days together. Each morning, she rose early, brushed her hair, selected a dress that felt right for the mood of the day, and wrote in her journal. Her handwriting had softened, her words more fluid, her reflections gentler. But something new had begun to stir inside her, something she couldn't name. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was something more powerful, like a quiet joy threaded with sorrow, the ache of realizing that the person she was becoming had been waiting far too long to exist. One afternoon, she sat beneath the willow tree at the edge of the garden, the same one that appeared in Eleanor's dreams. The air was warm, the light golden, and for the first time she felt utterly still inside. She wasn't thinking about the inheritance anymore. The condition, the will, even the year she'd promised, they all felt secondary. This wasn't about earning something material. It was about discovering something sacred. Mrs. Wren joined her, carrying a tray with 2 cups of tea. "You've been quiet lately," she said softly, sitting beside her. Adrian smiled faintly. "I think I'm just feeling too much all at once. It's hard to put into words." "Try," Mrs. Wren encouraged. Adrian stared into the rippling surface of her tea. "It's like I'm finally waking up, but I don't know from what. I used to think this was pretend, that I was just fulfilling a promise. But now, when I look in the mirror, I don't see Adrian pretending to be Adrian. I see Adrian wondering if Adrian was ever real at all." Mrs. Wren's eyes softened. "Your aunt once told me that awakening isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before the world taught you to forget." Adrienne's throat tightened. She saw this in me before I ever did. How could she have known? Mrs. Wren reached over and took her hand. Because she saw herself in you. She lived her truth late in life, and it broke her heart that you were starting to hide yours before you'd even found it. Adrienne blinked, stunned. Lived her truth. Mrs. Wren hesitated, then nodded. Your aunt didn't always live as Eleanor. The world seemed to still. Adrienne's heartbeat thundered in her ears. What do you mean? Mrs. Wren's voice was calm, almost tender. Her birth name was Edward Clark. She transitioned in her 30s. Quietly, privately. To the world she was eccentric, secretive. But to those of us who knew her, she was simply free. Adrienne's breath caught. She never told me. She wanted you to find out when you were ready, Mrs. Wren said. She used to say, one day, he'll understand why I call him Adrian. Adrienne stared out at the garden, tears brimming in her eyes. The puzzle pieces of her life fell into place. Eleanor's knowing looks, her cryptic words, her final wish. It wasn't a test or a punishment. It was a message. Legacy. The world blurred as Adrienne whispered. She saw me before I saw myself. That night, she lit a candle in the library and sat with her aunt's photograph. The air was thick with emotion, the flame flickering gently. I know now, she said softly. I know what you were trying to show me. A faint breeze stirred the curtains, as though the house itself exhaled. The emotional flood that followed was overwhelming. Years of unspoken feelings, of confusion, of quiet shame she hadn't even realized she carried. All of it poured out in trembling sobs. She didn't cry because she was sad. She cried because she finally understood. The next morning, she awoke with swollen eyes but a strangely calm heart. There was no fear left, no resistance. She dressed carefully, choosing a soft blue dress and pearl earrings. When she looked in the mirror, she smiled, not at the reflection but at the recognition. Later that day, she visited the village again, walking with ease, no longer adjusting her posture or tone. She didn't have to think about how to move or speak. It all came naturally. At the flower shop, Lila greeted her with a grin. Miss Clark, you look radiant today. Adrienne laughed softly. I feel lighter, I suppose. Lila handed her a small bouquet. You should. You've got that glow people get when they finally stop hiding. Adrienne tilted her head. What makes you say that? Lila smiled knowingly. Because I've been there too. They spoke for hours, not as strangers but as two women who recognized the same quiet truth in each other, the kind that didn't need explaining. When Adrienne returned to the manor that evening, she found another letter waiting on her vanity, written in Eleanor's familiar hand. My sweet Adrienne, if you found this letter, it means you've begun to understand. My life was not an easy one. The world was cruel to women like me. Women who were not born as such but knew their souls demanded it. I saw that same gentleness in you when you were young. I saw the same ache in your eyes that I once carried in mine. I could not let you live half a life pretending to be whole. So I left you a gift, the chance to see yourself without the mask. Now that you've seen it, you cannot unsee it. But that is not a curse, my darling. It's freedom. With endless love, Eleanor. Adrienne pressed the letter to her chest, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. There was no shock this time, no confusion. Only gratitude. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel divided. Adrienne and Adrienne were not two separate beings. They were fragments of the same soul, finally stitched together by truth. That evening, she took Eleanor's portrait down from the staircase wall and replaced it with a new one, a photograph Clara had taken of her recently. The resemblance was uncanny. Two women bound by blood and truth, both having walked the same painful, beautiful path. Standing before the new portrait, Adrienne whispered, "You didn't leave me a condition. You left me a mirror." The next day, she received another letter, this time from her mother. It was shorter, trembling with emotion. My dear Adrienne. No, I suppose Adrienne now. Mrs. Wren visited us yesterday. She told us everything. I won't pretend I understand it all, but I know this. I've never heard your voice sound as happy as it did on the phone last week. That's all a mother really wants, to hear her child happy. Come home whenever you're ready. We'll be here. Love, Mum. Adrian smiled through her tears. The fear she had once carried about her parents' rejection melted away into something pure and tender. She sat by the window that night, writing her response under the glow of a single candle. Mom, thank you. I'll come home soon, but when I do, it will be as me. Fully. Hope that's okay. She paused, then added, it feels right to sign this as Adrian. She sealed the letter with Eleanor's old wax stamp, the same one that had once sealed her own fateful note, and watched as the wax cooled into a perfect circle. Outside, the first hints of spring were beginning to bloom. The air carried the scent of renewal, of life beginning again. Adrian stood on the veranda, gazing at the horizon. The sky was painted in soft gold and violet, and for the first time she felt completely aligned with it. She whispered into the wind, "Thank you, Aunt Eleanor, for everything." The locket at her chest grew warm once more, and she swore she heard a faint, familiar whisper in return, gentle, proud, and full of love. "Now you understand, my dear. You were never becoming me. You were becoming you." And as the stars began to rise, Adrian realized that the awakening wasn't just emotional, it was spiritual, a return to self, rebirth. The house had fallen into a serene silence by the time Emily, no, Ethan or whoever that person was now, stood before the mirror once more. The air was heavy with the scent of lavender from Aunt Marianne's perfume, a faint echo of the past that seemed to wrap around the present. For the first time in months, there was no confusion clouding those deep hazel eyes, only understanding. The journey had not been about becoming someone new. It had been about discovering who had always been waiting underneath. The final letter from Aunt Marianne arrived on a Sunday morning, slipped neatly through the door in her elegant handwriting. Emily's hands trembled as she opened it, as though she already knew this would be the true conclusion to everything. "My dear, by now you have walked paths I once feared to tread. I never wanted to change you. I only wanted you to see yourself without the walls the world built around you. We are born into stories others write for us, but we must decide how they end. Whether you remain Ethan or live forever as Emily, that is not my wish to make. That is yours." The words were simple, yet they pierced deeply. The months of conflict, reflection, and discovery condensed into a single, undeniable truth. This had never been about gender or inheritance, not really. It had been about authenticity, about shedding the masks worn to appease others, and finding the courage to live truthfully, no matter what form that truth took. Emily folded the letter, her heart steady. The person in the mirror didn't look like a stranger anymore. The long auburn hair framed her face gently. Her skin carried warmth, her posture no longer hesitant. But when she smiled, it wasn't Emily's or Ethan's. It was hers. A person whole, unburdened, real. Her mother entered quietly, carrying a box tied with a red ribbon. "It's time," she said softly. Inside the box lay Aunt Marianne's favorite pendant, the silver locket shaped like a teardrop. Emily opened it, revealing a small picture of her aunt and a folded slip of paper. "When the time comes that you no longer need to pretend, wear this. Not as a symbol of what you were made to be, but of what you chose to become." Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she clasped the locket around her neck. Her mother watched silently, her own expression a mixture of grief and pride. "Your aunt would be so proud," she whispered. "I think she already is," Emily said, her voice steady. "And, maybe for the first time, I'm proud too." The following weeks passed quietly. The family began to see her not as a project, not as a condition of a will, but as someone fully realized. Her father, once uncertain and conflicted, joined her one evening on the porch. The setting sun bathed them in amber light. "I was wrong to think this was just a phase," he admitted. "Your aunt, she saw something I couldn't." Emily smiled faintly. "You don't have to understand everything, Dad. Just see me." He nodded slowly, eyes misty. "I do now." In that moment, the air seemed lighter, freer. The tension that had haunted the family dissolved like morning mist. The house no longer felt haunted by expectations. It felt alive, renewed. As autumn turned to winter, Emily visited the lake once more, where it had all begun. The surface reflected the gray sky, still and endless. She stood by the edge, the cold wind brushing against her cheeks, and whispered softly, "I kept your promise, Aunt Marianne." Her reflection rippled, and for an instant, she saw herself as both Ethan and Emily. Two halves of one truth, no longer in conflict but in harmony. She understood now that she didn't need to choose one over the other. She was both, the boy who once felt unseen, and the woman who finally felt alive. The transformation hadn't been about abandoning her past, but embracing it completely. As the sun broke through the clouds, she smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that carried all the years of confusion, grief, and awakening within it. The locket glimmered softly against her chest, catching the light. And with that, she turned away from the lake, walking toward the small path that led home. Every step felt lighter, more certain. The year was nearly over, but the journey had only just begun. Because this wasn't the end of Aunt Marianne's wish. It was the beginning of Emily's own. "Sometimes," she whispered to the wind, "you have to lose who you thought you were, to find who you've always been." The breeze carried her words away, mingling them with the fading scent of lavender and the soft hum of the earth. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, no longer afraid of what tomorrow might bring. She was no longer living a challenge. She was living truth. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to our channel.